Ladies, gentlemen, and pals of all ages, with multiple major updates hitting Palworld since the beginning of early access, not only have a bunch of new pals just been added to the game in general, but there have been changes made along the way as well to adjust the potential usefulness of every pre-existing pal as well. So today I'm going to rank every pal in the game against each other in terms of their combat ability, both in terms of they themselves fighting and any buffs they can give to the player as well, but then also anything else that makes it stand out otherwise, like being an exceptional base worker pal will have considerations too, and things like Smoky, which is just the most effective way to generate chromite as a very important resource, makes the pal itself more useful as a result. We will also of course run with the understanding that some pals are simply accomplishing the same thing in a weaker way than others, which puts them down a notch in comparison, and that pal element type does matter too, so realistically the top tier is unlikely to have multiple pals of the same typing unless there's a really good reason for that. It won't just be exactly identical things. All that said, let's start out with the absolute bottom tier here, just sort of blasting through it, because this tier is for pals that if you're using them, it's just because you like their design or you want to use them. There may be differences in usefulness between them, some of them might have some very little bits that they can give you, but they're in general just so irrelevant to the conversation compared to the rest of the list that it's not worth comparing them in detail, at least if you are someone who is out here looking to find power or efficiency in higher level gameplay. There's not much use distinguishing them outside of that. You can see the list I've got here, you know who all the pals are, and while they may have some niche use, it either just becomes unimportant later in the game, or they get totally outdone by another pal in the same role. This also includes things that have just been made obsolete by changes to the game in general, such as Wumpo and Wumpo Botan, thanks to the addition of things like weight elixirs to the game or the weight rate adjustment setting in the world settings, and as well with the new gold production line and how easy it is to make gold coins. A lot of the more classic ranch or farming pals have lost a lot of their value too. It's just really easy to make lots of gold coins very quickly and then buy that stuff from merchants now. That said, the next tier up is the D tier. Most of these are pals that definitely do have a use, but are just outshined in their particular role by another pal, or just by not being a strong sort of choice for the current hardest content in the game despite the potential of their role. First up, Pen King, mostly for the rare situation that you want bonus drops from fire pals. The partner skill does add that. Nightmare is useful if you're manually farming pal souls because the partner skill boosts drop rates for those, but doing that in the first place is pretty inefficient. Catris specifically is useful if you are farming dog coins by roaming around capturing Mimogs, and pretty much nothing else. Gorirat is okay, but neutral pals have no inherent advantages, which is a very big letdown for this pal specifically. Melpaka can be farmed for wool at the ranch, which is at least some value for the pal. Chickpea is the same for eggs, and Mozzarina the same for milk. However, these resources can also be bought for gold coins too, which means they have competition for that role now, because it is very easy to farm gold at a high level later on. Vixie has a chance of digging up pal spheres at the ranch, which does have niche use, but then Paldius, and yes, this is generally super low for a legendary pal, but neutral as a pal type is in itself quite weak, and these days Paldius isn't even the strongest neutral pal for combat anymore, so sticking him down here made sense to me, even though he does still have use just for traversal. He's simply not the best of anything he does, other than just having good base stats when you find him in the wild. Then we have Kitsune Noct. Applying dark type to player attacks while riding is pretty good, but there are better pals that have the exact same partner skill concept and better stats or moves to back it up. Grisbolt is a relatively good electric pal with a useful partner skill, but electric pals in general aren't in high demand as there is simply no high level water type threat in the game at this stage. Caperty Noct drops venom glands when farmed at the ranch, which is a useful niche to have. Then we hit Elizabeth, Sweepa, and Swee, which all sort of clump together for a very expectable reason. Elizabeth's partner skill gives it a massive stat boost for each B-guard that you have in the party, and Sweepa does the same with Swee. This can hit some pretty strong levels, but it runs the issue of forcing you to devote your entire pal team to one single interaction and one pal, and the actual reward, the return that you get for that amount of dedication, is not strong enough to justify it when just building around like player power and getting a tank pal in the 5th slot can achieve so much more, especially as it requires way less investment to achieve that. Then we have Azarobe. This applies water type to player damage while it's mounted. Not terrible, but just not a good enough pal to make the partner skill really worth using over a stronger water pal if you need to beat up a fire type pal, but it still does have some moments at least, which is why it's here. After that is Menacing, who is a fine pal, but inherently defensively oriented as opposed to being offense focused, and defensive pals aren't generally very good right now in the high end stuff, especially for a lot of endgame content. Just everything of real consequence has a timer attached to it, which plays directly against a defense focused setup because the more defensive you are, the slower you'll actually do the killing. The same goes for Menacing Terra, except that ground type generally can do a bit better offensively than dark type can, and then also the same thing for both Warsect and Warsect Terra, same issue because they are defensive focused pals in an offensive offense-focused world. Tombat as a pal has specific use with its partner skill, where if you're trying to track down something like farming Mimog, just like Catris, and Croagiro, I honestly could have put in the bottom tier, but its partner skill is both unique and an unusual source of movement that can have some benefits in certain very specific situations, I guess. Then we have Robinquill and Robinquill Terra. The partner skill boosts player weak point damage while this pal is out, which is a boost to player damage, but it is just much less of a boost than getting the pals that give you bonus damage of an elemental type, so it's sort of a waste to use comparative to those. Then Dinosom and Dinosom Lux. These boost the power of grass and electric attacks while being mounted respectively, and while it is a strong base partner skill type, the stats of the pals themselves are lower enough than the other pals of their typing that the bonus damage from this doesn't end up being worth it over just using the other pals. After that we have Loop Moon Christ, not a bad partner skill, giving it a second use of the pal exclusive combat skill that it has. It doesn't have terrible stats, and being ice type makes it better than standard Loop Moon being dark type to begin with, just based on the types of enemies that exist in the late and end game for Palworld currently. Then after that is Xenoguard, and Xenoguard isn't outright bad, but there are simply better pals at everything that it does, so D felt like the right sitting point for it in my opinion. Moving on then to the C tier, these pals are all genuinely useful for one purpose or another, but either only one thing or not to enough of a degree to be worth putting over anything in the higher tiers. First, Sootseer. You can farm it at the ranch, which gives you bones, which is nice, or you can mass breed and butcher it for crude oil, but it doesn't have too much use outside of that niche. Celesteer is technically the best lumbering pal in the game, and a solid ground mount as well once you have the saddle, but lumbering is one of, if not the least desired work skill for the late game of Palworld, and there are also better ground mount pals, so it is just simply outdone. Fengalope and Fengalope Lux are both just very solid ground mounts. They're less than the best, but better than most, and for combat they're just sort of okay, but the actual mounting is why you'd want them. Hellzephyr changes player attacks to dark damage while ridden, which is a solid partner skill, but dark damage isn't overly desirable as a damage type, and outside of that the pal is relatively unremarkable outside from being a decent transporter and base. Then you have Moraith, basically identical to Hellzephyr as far as the partner skill, maybe a touch worse than Hellzephyr statistically, but not like a whole tier down worth at least. Then Mossanda and Mossanda Lux, mostly for their partner skill grenade launcher ability, being able to stunlock a lot of enemies in the game. This has some niche use, but it is definitely not quite as good long term as just pure high damage combat pals, which is why I've got them in the tier that I do. Then we have Vanworm, which is just a really good transporting pal, decent partner skill giving you bonus damage to weak points, but as we discussed with Robinquill and Robinquill Terra, that partner skill type just gets heavily outscaled by the element focused ones. Vanworm Christ, sort of the same thing, but it's ice type, which does have slightly more value than a dark type pal, just because of how the enemies work out in the late game. Then there is Lulu, who is fully just has a purpose as a base supporting pal, but there are better ones than this really for similar purposes, especially with the Feybreak update basically just making this one obsolete. Taranturas is a fantastic movement focused pal, especially before you get rid of the missile launchers on Feybreak Island. Decent combat pal, but this is mostly just for being solid movement, especially with vertical movement without needing to fly. Dumb Mud can get you high quality pal oil when farmed at the ranch, but now that gold coins are much easier to generate and you can also buy this resource from merchants, it just is much less valuable. Sparkit is the first pal on this list that passively boosts other pals by being in your party. If you are trying to boost the hell out of an electric type pal, you would want a bunch of Sparkits in the party and the other slots to boost their damage further. That said, while the concept of the partner skill is strong, no current endgame challenge is super affected by electric type pals, which means that this leaves this one just down in C tier as far as I'm concerned. Then Ragnahawk, good flying mount pal, good kingling pal, not bad combat pal either, but outdone in all three of those aspects by others that are higher up in this list. Then finally for C tier is Sibilix, purely for the purpose of being farmed at the ranch for high quality cloth, and that's it. Moving on then to the B tier now, these are all pals that excel at something specific, but it's either something with lower priority or just something that enables other setups rather than being the star of the show itself. First up, Smokey. This pal's main use is finding chromite for you in caves and boosting the drop rates when you destroy the rocks with it out as well. It is incredible for this purpose, but that is about it. Hellzephyr Lux is a great electric type pal due to having solid stats in itself, but then also giving electric type damage to the player while being ridden. However, again, electric type for combat is just not a really big deal in the current late game layout, which is why it's here. Beeguard is the only pal that you can plop at the ranch to create honey for you at your base. Honey is a meaningful resource, but just mostly for the fact that you can make it into cakes, which is great for breeding, so this does have very good use in itself. But then also, if you do choose to run an Elizabeth setup like we talked about earlier, Beeguard are just completely very much important to that too. Phalaris is just a very solid fire pal that also works as a very good flying mount too. Yakimo entirely exists for managing other pals, passing down passive traits through catching, which can enable you to set up breeding combos easier if you have a good Yakimo to begin with. Galeclaw and both of the Hangyu are here for their partner skill, which makes them act as gliders when you have them in your party. Galeclaw is better for speed and distance explicitly, though Hangyu can actually gain verticality if you use it right to let you climb with gliding. And these are here just as grappling hook cancel. Glider flinging yourself around the map is a really efficient thing to do if you're not going to be flying. Then we have Rue, Kelpsy, Kelpsy Ignis, Hucrites, and Foxicle, which are all pals that boost the power of other pals in your party depending on their element: fire, water, dark, and ice respectively. None of these will be your main pal, but they have a lot of potential for boosting the power of your main pal. Then we have Dazimu as just another really solid ground mount pal, followed by Bushi and Bushi Noct. Both of these have a strong pal exclusive ability, and their partner skill allows them to use it essentially a second time per cooldown. Then Gildane, decent ground mount, changes player damage to ground while ridden, which is a high tier partner skill, but the best ground pals are simply way better than what this can offer even then. Then we get up onto the A tier. These are genuinely very good pals, some of the best in the game, for a combination of combat or resource generating reasons. First up, Anubis. This is either the best or second best handiwork pal, depending on how you look at it, and it's also probably the second best ground type combat pal as well. The only singular reason it's not higher ranked is because it's not the clear-cut winner for base work, and the one ground type combat pal that's above it is so far above it. Then Splatterina, the other consideration for best handiwork pal added in Feybreak. This one has level 4 handicraft base, so it can be boosted up to 5, which is great. It's dark type, so it's naturally nocturnal, which saves you a passive slot, and this pal is extremely efficient to have working on your base as a result. But it's not a great combat pal, which does limit it up at the A tier here, even if I do think it is the best handiwork pal in the game. Then Azurmane, this is fantastic as a ground mount pal, added in Feybreak, ridiculously fast, very effective for that specific purpose, and also the second best natural electricity generator pal for base work too, which is a nice bonus. For combat, it's not bad either, but it isn't quite the best. Selene then is the strongest neutral pal for combat in the game. There's no other real bonus that this pal will give you, but it is very powerful for that. However, I've decided that even so, it gets locked into A tier, even being the strongest of its typing, because of a lack of meaningful base work suitabilities, and because a powerful neutral type pal will never actually be able to super affect anything, so it is a very limited typing to even boost to begin with. Then we have Yormintide. Very good as a combat pal, great as a watering pal, but not quite the best of either. Pretty much the same for Yormintide Ignis, except as a fire type pal and a kindling pal for the base work. Lylene is a solid grass type combat pal, defensively speaking, which isn't ideal. However, this one is boosted heavily by being great at multiple different parts of your base work setup, which is mostly why you would actually want a Lylene, just as a great sort of jack of all trades within your base. As for grass-based combat specifically, the best is Verdash, who applies grass type to the player's damage while out, letting you take care of any ground types really effectively with your own weapons. However, there is a limited amount of high-powered ground enemies in the late game or the end game, and while it is the best that grass damage has, it's still not crazy strong statistically speaking outside of that reason. After that is Felbat, whose main purpose is the partner skill that gives you and the pal lifesteal while it's out. This isn't crazy early on, but this has a very valid place in pure player boosting setups, where you run 4 Gobfin and a Felbat with like a legendary weapon, so you can deal massive damage to pals and then use the leech from the partner skill to heal yourself off of it, which is fantastic for things like longer tower boss fights. Then finally in this tier is Frostallion Noct. This pal has the highest attack stat of any dark pal, and it applies dark typing to player damage while ridden, but dark as a typing is somewhat limited, and while it does have a max level work suitability, it's only in Gathering, which isn't a fantastic one to have if you had to choose. After that then we have the S tier. This is all of the best pals for various purposes in the game, except for one singular pal that got in the S plus tier all by itself. Starting this one off then is Phalaris Aqua. This pal is a very strong water type pal for combat, arguably the best. It's a decent enough flying mount as well. It makes fire pals drop extra items when defeated for its partner skill, and on top of its combat benefit, it is also a tier 4 watering pal for your base, and one of, if not the best transporting pal by a combined metric of its size, movement speed, and carry load. Then we have Astagon, the best mining pal in the game, especially being dark type, so naturally nocturnal. pal, but then also a really solid combat pal on top of that too. Chill It is the pal that when ridden applies dragon damage to player attacks, and this has an absolutely massive value potential for any enemy that is weak to dragon damage, which a few of the higher tier enemies actually are. Speaking of which, Necromus is one of the best ground mount pals combined with being extremely strong as a dark combat pal. Or Zerk is the best electricity generation pal without counting things like applied technique manuals, and either second best or best electric type combat pal as well. Bellinard Libero is arguably the best dark combat pal. It has high movement and large AoE attacks just because of the way that it works, less utility than the other S tier dark pals, but great moveset. Then we have Bastigor. This is the best set and forget it ice pal, alternatively the best one to use within your base itself for fighting, maybe even for things like a Xenolord, as it excels as an ice pal without requiring you to ride it to achieve its power. It's also fantastic for cooling your base too, as far as its actual base work. After that is Blasphemous, the strongest fire pal for pure combat, especially with its partner skill, that massively increases fire damage when ridden. And then Shadowbeak, who is arguably the strongest dark combat pal if you're willing to stay ridden on it, as a flying mount with two fantastic pal exclusive skills, and the partner skill that boosts its own damage while ridden significantly to go along with it. Then we have Prunella, a new pal in Feybreak, and this pal increases the harvest rate of crops that you plant and farm in your base with it active, meaning that it increases the amount that you get every time that you harvest. This bonus actually stacks with having multiple Prunellas in your base too, and if you have a farming setup in your base that you care about, this pal is just irreplaceably good. No, it doesn't have much combat potential, but I cannot express how good this is for a base farming setup if you are running one of any kind, which is why it's the only base exclusive pal all the way up in this tier. Then we have Xenolord, one of the two strongest dragon type pals in the game. Great pal specific skills, no real base compatibility really, but solid for any pure dragon type needs. Then we have Gobvin and Gobvin Ignis, both of these purely for their partner skill, which boosts player attack damage while they are in the party, as most super high-end loadouts will have fully kitted out players running 4 of these in their party, and then one pal of their choice to actually have active. After that is going to be Jetragon. This thing is the king of travel pals, fastest aerial movement, and especially with the ability to breed stamina consumption passives onto it now too, it is just an incredibly effective movement mount that is decent enough at actual combat too. Next up is Blasphemous Ryu. This one is just a fantastic dragon combat pal, arguably the best one, definitely top 2, and if you're willing to ride it and control it manually as it boosts its own damage of dragon attacks while ridden, it's definitely the best one. Then as far as base work purposes, it's also a max level mining and kindling pal too as a bonus. Finally then for the S tier is Frost Stallion. Max level cooling for your base, which is great, and then either best or second best ice combat pal depending on how you look at it, with the massive bonus of giving you ice type on player damage while ridden, which is just absolutely massive against any ice weak pals. Finally then we have the S plus tier. This tier has one pal and it's Nochlum. If you know what's up, you already know, but Nochlum's partner skill when activated at full essence condensing, full 4-star ranking and such, is literally will triple Nochlum's both attack and defense stat. So a well-built Nochlum with good passives and IVs with star ranks added on can essentially be a singular main combat pal strong enough to crush anything that you throw it at as long as that partner skill is active. It is nut strong. It is simply above the rest when it comes to combat, and it also has some use in your base as a transporter too as a little bonus as well. That just about does it for today then everyone. A tier list ranking every pal in Palworld as of the Feybreak update for their effectiveness either in combat or for helping you generate resources, either as part of your base or just a byproduct of their pal skills when used correctly. This isn't meant to be a be-all end-all list of the things that you should care about or ignore in the game. After all, a lot of games like this is just about finding pals that you like, but I thought it may be helpful to put together a list based on all these varied criteria and just sort of talking my way through my thoughts on the positions as well, so you'd actually have that information. Like if you liked the video, subscribe with the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.